There's a movement to sort of gloat over the fact that the elites were right about Donald Trump, right? I'm a never Trump guy. I never liked him. I can't stomach Trump. I think that he's noxious and is leading the white working class to a very dark place.
It's unfortunate in a lot of ways because I think in many ways what Trump is just another opioid. He's something that's going to take the pain away. He's going to make people feel better for a little while.
A leader who rejects Joe Biden and Kamala Harris's Green New scam and fights to bring back our great American factories. We need President Donald J. Trump.
J.D. Vance is many things. Ohio Senator, New York Times bestselling author, a venture capitalist, a graduate of Yale Law School, and if Donald Trump wins once again for the upcoming 2024 presidential race, Vance would become the third youngest vice president in US history as well as the first VP since 1933 with facial hair. But there's one thing he is not. A populist. While the mainstream media from CNN, Time Magazine, the BBC, and Bloomberg all describe him as such, and even with some labor leaders such as the president of the Teamsters Union Sean O'Brien expressing excitement over Trump's VP pick, J.D. Vance is in fact an anti-populist. He got his political start in elite circles, making rounds in liberal seminars, panels, and TED Talks where he regularly lambasted the working class for their supposed laziness. While he may portray himself as a politician standing up for the working man, his whole political career began by blaming the working poor for their own poverty. Before being elected senator, Vance first rose to prominence in the summer of 2016. Donald Trump had just clinched the Republican nomination by defeating over a dozen establishment GOP candidates in a stunning upset. And liberal Democrats were scratching their heads trying to find an explanation as to why so many white working class voters were flocking to the real estate tycoon and reality TV star as their quote-unquote populist champion. J.D. Vance, then a 31-year-old venture capitalist, came onto the scene out of nowhere with the easy answers that liberals were looking for. He had just published his book, Hillbilly Elegy, a memoir of family and culture in crisis, and it was an instant bestseller. Although Vance does not mention Trump by name once in his autobiography, the harrowing account of his upbringing by a white working-class family in rural Appalachia earned praise from liberals as some sort of Trump voter whisperer. The Los Angeles Times wrote a review with the headline, "J.D. Vance's Hillbilly Elegy provides a window into the pain and anger of Trump's America." Bill Gates lauded the book in a review for Time Magazine. Vance made regular appearances in the liberal media from MSNBC to CNN with pundits gushing over his book. After the 2016 presidential election, the New York Times listed Hillbilly Elegy as one of the 6 books to help understand Trump's win, and columnists such as David Brooks were similarly lavish in their praises. After Trump became president in 2017, Vogue published a softball interview with the author that asked in its title, "J.D. Vance for President?" The hype culminated in 2020 when Netflix released a film adaptation of the book directed by Ron Howard and starring Glenn Close. Howard identifies as a strong Democrat and Close had once fundraised for Hillary Clinton. But when J.D. Vance ran for Senate as a Republican in 2022, the liberal pundits who once praised him suddenly felt betrayed. Their explanation was that Vance went through a political evolution and had been radicalized by Trump. Or as Tom Nichols from The Atlantic put it, Vance had a moral collapse by betraying the values he once believed in. In other words, the liberals weren't wrong to adore J.D. Vance back in 2016. It's just that he had gone through an unfortunate metamorphosis. However, J.D. Vance has always been the same person. He may have switched allegiances from being a self-described never Trump guy to Donald Trump's running mate, but his ideology has never really changed. Despite the initial positive response from liberal readers of Hillbilly Elegy, Vance is an anti-populist right-winger who loathes the working class. This isn't something he cleverly hid. It is there in black and white in the pages of his bestseller. So let's take a close look at the book that first made J.D. Vance a fixture in American politics. And, along the way, maybe we can try to figure out why all those liberal elites who now oppose the Trump-Vance ticket loved Hillbilly Elegy when it first came out. In the book, J.D. Vance tells his life story growing up in a broken white working-class family in Appalachia, where he bounced back and forth between the rural town of Jackson, Kentucky and the deindustrialized suburb of Middletown, Ohio. In his early childhood, JD was raised by his single mother who suffered from drug addiction, but by the 10th grade, he lived with his grandmother Bonnie Vance, who he calls Mama. There is no question that JD Vance had a tough childhood. There are a number of dark episodes scattered throughout the book, such as when JD's mother had a mental breakdown, drove 100 miles per hour, and told her son in the back seat that she was going to crash the car and kill them both. It was also the time when JD's mother begged her own son for his urine so she could pass a drug test and keep her job. Even as JD was a young adult at Yale Law School, his mother's addiction continued as she went from abusing prescription drugs to injecting heroin. JD Vance's childhood began to stabilize to a certain degree when he moved in with his grandmother. He describes his mama twice in the book as the best thing that happened to me. So in order to understand JD Vance's ideology, we first need to examine this crucial person in his upbringing. Although JD Vance claims that his grandmother and grandfather spent the last 2 decades of their lives showing the value of love and stability and teaching the life lessons that most people learn from their parents, his grandmother, Bonnie Vance, must be described as anything but loving. Throughout the 257 pages of the book, the author describes his grandmother in great detail, and not once does she come off as compassionate. There are episodes when Bonnie Vance threw a vase at her husband, causing a gash in his forehead, or another time when she almost killed her husband by lighting him on fire. She threatened to run over her marijuana-smoking neighbors if they were spotted hanging out with JD. And when JD's mother attempted to end her life by trying to crash her car again, Bonnie Vance exhibited a cold-heartedness that transcends the routine antagonism of a mother-daughter relationship. Speaking to her own grandson, she claimed her daughter's attempt to take her own life was just to get attention. Who tries to kill themselves by crashing a car, she asked, adding, if she wanted to kill herself, I've got plenty of guns. Generous perhaps, but certainly not compassionate. I could go on with a dozen more examples of the abusive nature of Bonnie Vance. But JD Vance deludes himself throughout the book by saying she saved him. Reading between the lines of all the anecdotes JD tells of his grandmother, she comes across as someone who corrupted her own grandson with a twisted view of the world that made him hate his own class. Never be like those losers who think the deck is stacked against them, Bonnie Vance would tell her own grandson. She hated the working poor who relied on food stamps because, as she would say, God helps those who help themselves, which of course is not in any biblical text. She thought it was a quote-unquote betrayal that one of her oldest friends moved in next door by registering for Section 8, a government rental assistance housing program, believing that quote-unquote bad people would move in. JD, of course, doesn't specify what she meant by quote-unquote bad people. Bonnie Vance also called her own daughter's third husband a toothless because, as JD put it, though she was hardly rich, she wanted her kids to get an education, obtain white-collar work, and marry well-groomed middle-class folks. People, in other words, who were nothing like Mama. Instead of making her grandson proud of their background and giving him a sense of working-class solidarity, she instilled in him a loathing of their own kind. By the time he was living with her during his high school years, JD Vance says that he began to see the world as Mama did. He writes, I was scared, confused, angry, and heartbroken. I'd blame large businesses for closing up shop and moving overseas, and then I'd wonder if I might have done the same thing. It was through his grandmother's influence that JD Vance's right-wing reactionary ideology took shape. He began to blame his fellow working poor for their own oppression. In his adolescence, JD read Losing Ground by the racist eugenicist Charles Murray, who has argued against anti-poverty government programs with the claims about welfare recipients having low IQ. At 17, when Vance took a job at a local grocery store, he despised his drug addict neighbor for using food stamps to buy T-bone steaks. Vance writes that he has known many welfare queens, some were my neighbors, and all were white. He also claims that you can walk through a town where 30% of young men work fewer than 20 hours a week and find not a single person aware of his own laziness. It is worth mentioning that he doesn't provide any citation where he got the number 30%. He also doesn't shy away from condemning his own poor neighbors and even his own mother, labeling them as consumerist, isolated, angry, and distrustful. J.D. Vance's cynical depiction of the white working class is precisely why Hillbilly Elegy was such a huge hit with liberals and never-Trumpers. Donald Trump's rise in 2016 should have been a self-reflective moment for the political establishment, giving them a chance to realize that their own neoliberal policies escalated poverty and left many voters angry. But here came J.D. Vance with the easy answers. His entire thesis is not that the white working class was flocking to Trump because of the elites failed, it was simply that the poor are lazy and their oppression is their own fault. When the neoliberalism of Bill Clinton and Barack Obama led to increased wealth disparity, Vance arrived on the scene to tell the elites, essentially, that they had done nothing wrong. The losers in the rift in wealth disparity were themselves to blame. As he claims in the introduction of his book, the real problem with the economy is that too many young men are immune to hard work, carelessly tossing aside a good job with excellent health insurance. Vance repeatedly defends the political establishment, saying that the white working class needs to make better choices and that they need to ask tough questions about themselves. People are poor because there is a cultural movement in the white working class to blame problems on society or the government, and that movement gains adherents by the day. Vance, however, admits that he himself doesn't know what the answer is, but he claims that it starts when we stop blaming Obama or Bush or faceless companies and ask ourselves what we can do to make things better. Heaping praise on the rich and justifying their own privilege and giving liberal Democrats what they want to hear, Vance claims that what separates the successful from the unsuccessful are the expectations that they had for their own lives. Yet the message of the right is increasingly, it's not your fault that you're a loser, it's the government's fault. So clearly, Vance is not blaming the government, which he actually believes is helpless. People sometimes ask whether I think there's anything we can do to solve the problems of my community. Vance writes, I know what they're looking for, a magical public policy solution or an innovative government program. But these problems of family, faith, and culture aren't like a Rubik's Cube, and I don't think the solutions, as most understand the term, really exist. So, according to the man now running for vice president, there is no public policy that can help the poor and working class. Why bother doing anything at all? This leads to the question, if the government can't do anything, why did Vance eventually choose to seek public office? The hypocrisy latent in the political ambitions of a man who doesn't think the government can help the working poor can also be seen in the very ways that Vance himself escaped poverty. When he rants that there is no government that can fix these problems, he seems to completely ignore his own reliance on government programs. I had Pell Grants and government-subsidized low-interest student loans that made college affordable and need-based scholarship for law school, he admits in his book. Yet, he fails to concede that the government can help the kind of people he grew up with. They, apparently, were irredeemable. So clearly, there are in fact magical public policy solutions that can lift the white working class out of poverty. Even though he benefited from a prestigious university education thanks to government assistance, Vance has called student debt forgiveness a massive windfall to the rich, to the college educated, and most of all to the corrupt university administrators of America. J.D. Vance also does not support universal health care, which would have saved his grandmother who, as he recalls in his book, had her premiums skyrocket. As senator, he didn't support the Build Back Better Act, which included paid maternity leave that would have benefited people like his own mother. He also didn't support the PRO Act that would have increased union membership. J.D. Vance is a class traitor who became a blood-sucking venture capitalist. And he became the vice presidential nominee for the Republican Party because billionaires like Peter Thiel and Elon Musk demanded that he be picked. He is not a populist, which is a label that used to mean something in this country. As I pointed out in a previous video on this channel, Why the Left Needs Populism with the historian Thomas Frank. In some ways, on the surface level, Vance's rhetoric can be described as populist. In his speech at the RNC, he sounded almost like Bernie Sanders when he attacked President Biden for having supported NAFTA, which he called a bad trade deal that sent countless good jobs to Mexico. He also criticized Biden for having given a sweetheart trade deal that destroyed even more good American middle-class manufacturing jobs. And yet, as he writes in Hillbilly Elegy, these neoliberal free trade deals are apparently not the reason why working-class Americans are struggling. As he says in the book, we choose not to work when we should be looking for jobs. We talk about the value of hard work but tell ourselves that the reason we're not working is some perceived unfairness. Obama shut down the coal mines or all the jobs went to the Chinese. These are lies we tell ourselves to solve the cognitive dissonance, the broken connection between the world we see and the values we preach. J.D. Vance is an anti-populist who rose to power thanks to the elites who wanted to blame their own policy failures on the working poor. His top donors include the American Financial Group, as well as the Blackstone Group, which has bought up cheap foreclosed homes across America and made billions by renting them out with jacked up costs. Vance has introduced anti-labor legislation in the Senate, such as the Teamwork for Employees and Managers Act, which would let employers run fake unions called employee involvement organizations, with no collective bargaining rights. In December 2023, he gave a speech at a right-wing think tank where he distinguished between supporting quote-unquote good unions, such as police unions, and quote-unquote bad unions like that for Starbucks baristas. And Vance is now a running mate to a billionaire whose only real legislative accomplishment when president was a giant tax break for the rich. The very last lines for Hillbilly Elegy could not be more fitting. In the final 3 sentences of the book, Vance writes, "Tomorrow I would go to work, take the dogs to the park, buy groceries with Usha, and make a nice dinner. It was everything I ever wanted. So I patted Casper's head and went back to sleep." J.D. Vance, the author who wrote a 257-page memoir about how the white working class needs self-reflection, has his eyes shut. He doesn't want to see how it was actually policies from the elites that left so many working families struggling. He doesn't want to know about how poverty is a creation of the rich. If he is elected vice president of the United States by fooling and winning over white working class voters, it would be the blind leading the blind.